Време на пандемия. Време за избор. От ръба на оцеляването до световните постижения. София на пътя на иновациите. Време е за среща на върха.
Hello everyone, I'm so glad to be at Innovation Explorer again. 1 year from now we spoke about economics, and today we continue from the previous speaker from foreign policy into economic policies. This time we're going to focus on growth-led institutions. Now before we start, I'd like to spend an emotional moment about last year. It's been a very difficult year for the entire world. In fact, 2020 was the year when the modern man met death again. We've seen a lot of dear friends of ours go through sickness and pass away. Let's remember them and think of all the hardships that the world has been through. Many of those friends are not going to be with us. They're not going to pick up the phone. But I'd like to start my lecture with a message of hope, actually, human hope. And this message is centered about the story of my grandma. Now, Grandma spent last year lockdowns together with us. We took her in with our family because she's all alone. She's 92. And we had a lot of time talking to her. And we asked her, Grandma, what is it that you remember about World War II? What's the most dear memory that you hold? Now, you got to know, she spent actually pretty horrible time during World War II. As part of the Holocaust, she was deported. Her family members were in camps working, toil. She had to toil to feed the family. She was barely a teenager then. She was cramped in a school with many other families living together, barely making a living for years. We asked her, Grandma, what is it that you really remember about those years of hardship? Because, last year lockdowns kind of reminded us of those times. You notice what is the one thing that she vividly remembers 70 years later on? It's only love. In those years, she met her teenage love, and it was this pure emotion that kept her going. She not only survived, she thrived, and she actually, helped by this true love of her heart, found the real love of her life, which was science and research and innovation. She grew to become a professor in molecular biology and spent her life in research and innovation for the next part of 70 years. Now, this is the story of my grandma. And here we are talking about growth, economic growth. Last year we spoke a lot about growth from exactly the same research and innovation that she fostered all her life. Now, research and innovation is one of the drivers of growth, along with capital and labor. Now, 2020 has been a difficult year for the whole world economically. But make no mistake, growth is coming back. In fact, growth is coming back big time. According to the latest EU research, growth is going to be double the EU average next year. We're talking north of 4%. And that's fantastic news. How do we make use of that? How do we sustain this growth? That is the question. Getting back into growth mode is not an easy task. Now, economists have created an alphabetic soup of models how recovery takes place. We might have a V-shaped recovery, similar to what we see in China, where you fall and then you recover pretty quickly back to the same levels of economic activity. You might have U-shaped recovery, where you linger at the bottom a little bit longer and then you take off. God forbid, we might be in a Nike-shaped recovery, where we linger at the bottom pretty long, and then we take a long time to recover the economic activity to where it used to be. Even more sadly, economists have designed also K-shaped recovery, where some parts of the world recover fast, others recover slow. Rich thrive, poor survive. The question is, where do we want to be as a society, as a country? Now, how does growth come about? Last year we spoke about it. It's going to come from ideas and innovation. That's one of the drivers of growth. And this year's pandemic has shown us what type of innovation is going to drive growth globally. It's technology and biology. There is no doubt that biotech is where the future of the biggest innovation is going to happen. We're going to see internet levels of accelerated growth in everything that has to do with biology, medical, pharmaceutics. The speed of development of the new vaccine is just the first example of what we are about to witness in the coming decade in terms of biotech innovation. Again, innovation is one engine of growth. This time around, innovation is going to be led by government. Governments are going to spend enormous amounts of money popping up the economies of the world. And there is no doubt about it. In April, developed countries had already spent nearly 5% of their GDPs trying to prop up their economies. And as of October, we see double-digit numbers, not only in developed economies, but also in developing economies. So like it or not, we're going to see a lot of government spending on the economy. When I say like it or not, it's a bit of a euphemism because we know for sure that people like it. The EBRD survey that you see behind me shows clearly that, perhaps a bit surprisingly, populations in high-income economies are very supportive of government interventions when they have experienced economic hardships in their formative years. In other words, we expect that the young generations of today will be supportive of government-led interventions in the economy for some time to come. Now, is government intervention good or bad? If you look at the same EBRD report, you'll see that there are positives to it. It stabilizes employment, for example, but there are also negatives. The question is how capable government administration is to lead massive investments. Is it capacity, skill sets, or plain corruption that can hamper the efficiency of such government-led efforts? There's been a lot of research actually in the economic history that government-led investment into the economy is not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, some of that research shows that it actually promotes openness of the economies. And in fact, it's not so much about whether or not it's big state and a lot of spending, but it's the quality of the government spending that matters to the economic growth generation. At this point, perhaps let's spend a minute trying to define what is good government spending in purely economic terms. Perhaps the cleanest definition that we can put today is government spending is good when it generates growth, and particularly long-term growth. Therefore, we need government agencies, institutions that are focused on long-term growth rather than political cycles. Political cycles are shorter than economic cycles, and therefore we need institutions with a long horizon of their vision, where we want to be. Is that even possible? Are there places where institutions have such long-term vision? What needs to be achieved? Well, let's bring out two examples. Example number one, Israel. 2019, Israel has attracted $8.3 billion of venture investment in its innovation economy. Now let's try to bring that into perspective. Israel has attracted $8 billion of investment for innovation, whereas Germany, 10 times bigger economy, has attracted about $7 billion. France, again, more than 10 times the size of the economy, $4 billion. So what's special about Israel? Why is a small economy, 10 times smaller than France's or Germany's, able to attract more capital into its innovation? What is it there? Well, in fact, it's simple. There are a lot more startups in Israel than in those countries. How come? Why there are so many startups in Israel? Well, there are many startups in Israel because there have been a lot of startups in Israel. Already during the dot-com era, in the boom times, Israel hosted more startups than anywhere else than the Silicon Valley. So how come Israel has so many startups for already 20 years? Well, it has because Israeli governments spend money fostering venture capital culture over many, many years. Already in the 90s, there were not one, not two, not three, but 4 different government programs incubating venture capital, trying to bring private equity into the country to stimulate the birth of startups. And it did bring fruits. It did generate massive investments already then. So you would say, okay, they had a lot of startups during the 2000s and they invested a lot of government money to create venture capital in the 90s. But why did this money come in the 90s? Well, it came because 20 years earlier, Israel started investing government funds into research and development. And those government funds won in the single digits, and then the double digits, and then the triple digits. And they initially attracted no foreign investment, and then it slowly started to add up the private sector. In other words, we're talking about growth institutions that recognized how important research is for decades, and they kept putting the government money into those strategic interests. Today, as a result of that, Israel continues to spend double the EU average on research and development. So, as we might guess, it will continue to lead in terms of attracting foreign investment for innovation. Another example, perhaps closer to our European hearts, is Estonia. Estonia spends about 1.2% of its GDP on e-government. For a small country, that results in mere 100 and something million euros. Now, what do they actually get for these 130 million euros? Well, they have electronic customs, they have electronic signature, they have electronic taxes, they even have electronic voting, for God's sakes. And they have it for the past 20 years. In other words, Estonian institutions have had the foresight, the tenacity, and the vision to sustain spending and build these services for the good part of 2 decades already. This is why Estonia today is widely recognized as the digital leader in Europe. Not too complicated. Have your institution spend long enough on a certain goal and you will achieve those results. Let's have a look what we do here. Here in our country, we have the Fund of Funds. It's a 700 million effort, a very sizable budget, and it has been around for more than 5 years. Can we see tangible results of what the Fund of Funds have achieved? Only now, after 5 years, some signs are starting to come up. But certainly, the numbers do not match the expectations that the leaders in the world have already set for us. We now have the new effort, the Innovation Agency, another 800 million that is going to be spent on innovation. It's time for us to rise up and demand that these institutions focus on the long-term growth of innovation in our country. Thank you very much.